Okay, so today's topic is, as I mentioned, the respiratory system, which is a nice follow-up from the cardiovascular. Everything all kind of fits in, kind of complements each other. Remember, the cardiovascular, we're looking at pumping blood by way of the heart through blood vessels. And in that blood, of course, we've got several different things. Among them, of course, is oxygen. And oxygen gets pumped from the blood to the tissues, and then CO2 gets removed from the tissues. So we depend on the blood for this transport. And of course, the respiratory system, which is a nice complement to that, is where we see the consequences of that, how the oxygen is transferred to the tissues and how we utilize it and how we generate carbon dioxide and all the organs involved with that. With the cardiovascular, of course, we're talking about the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood. With the respiratory, we'll be looking at a whole host of structures, but fortunately, we can divide all those structures into two main categories, as we'll see, what we call the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. All right, so functionally, what is the role or what are the roles of the respiratory system? First and foremost, it's to, first of all, transport air to and from what we call gas exchange surfaces. So for example, transporting air from the outside world into the lungs and eventually into the blood. With carbon dioxide, it goes the other way. It goes from the blood to the respiratory organs, such as the lungs, and then out. So everything kind of works in opposite. So the whole idea of transporting gases so they can be exchanged and moving it through the blood. So from the air to the respiratory surface and from the respiratory surface to the blood. That's oxygen. From CO2, it's from the blood to the respiratory surface and from the respiratory surface to the outside world. And of course, it's called the respiratory system, so that makes sense. But it's important to realize that there's a much, not any more important, not any less important, the role of the respiratory system in filtering air. And the air that comes into our body, even though the air in San Diego is much better than when I grew up in Los Angeles many years ago with all the smog, but nonetheless, it's not pure. There's particles in it. Before that gas reaches the respiratory surface, it needs to be filtered and conditioned, modified, and we'll learn about that. Things, the role of mucus in the respiratory tract, the role of ciliated epithelium, and of course, the role of specialized macrophages, very similar to the macrophages we saw in the nervous system with the microglia. So before we move air into the blood, into the lungs and the blood, we need to make sure it's clean. Next function is something I'm just going to mention in name only. I'm not going to go into any details, is the role in vocal communication. One of the respiratory structures is the larynx, and that serves a secondary role as the voice box. So we use that to generate sound. A final role, and this is actually a direct consequence of the regulation of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the body, is the fact that the respiratory system controls the volume of blood, the pH, and pressure, air pressure. And of course, a lot of this has to do with the ability to regulate how much CO2 gets in the body. You're very familiar with times when you hyperventilate. One of the reasons why we hyperventilate is because there's too much carbon dioxide in the body, which changes the pH, something we learn a lot about in physiology. The blood becomes too acidic, and we need to get rid of that. So not only breathing, but how deep we breathe and how fast we breathe helps to regulate blood volume, pH, and pressure. All right, so now to get into the nitty-gritty, what is the anatomy of the respiratory system? As I mentioned, there are several structures, all beginning with the nasal cavity, the nose. So when we breathe in, some people, you might think, well, we breathe into our mouth. Well, You might a little bit, but the mouth is not part of your respiratory system. It's part of your digestive system, just because the role of enzymes, teeth, and tongue in there. The initial respiratory structure is the nose. Once air enters into the nose, the whole filtering process starts to take place, and we'll learn more about that shortly. Once it passes from the nasal cavity, the air then passes in through what's called the pharynx, which is this common cavity that is also behind the mouth, as well as the nasal cavity. It's basically a space, kind of a common cavity. From the pharynx, air then continues into the larynx, which is a cartilaginous structure we'll learn about as well. And from the larynx, the air then enters into this kind of a ringed structure, ringed with cartilage. This is the trachea. And from the trachea, then air passes into the bronchi, which are these small branches, and finally into the bronchioles, and then eventually within the lungs, we have little structures called alveoli. And it's really in the smaller bronchioles and in the alveoli where the actual process of gas exchange occurs. And when I mean gas exchange, I'm referring to moving oxygen into the blood and moving CO2 from the blood into the lungs. So the terms bronchi, bronchiole, that's kind of comparable to when we were talking about arteries and arterioles, right? The arteries branch into smaller arterioles, increases the surface area, and eventually you reach the capillaries. In this case, instead of the capillaries, we have the alveoli, which it greatly increases the surface area for gas exchange, much like the capillaries increases the surface area for movement of blood into the, or movement of blood from the capillaries into the tissues. All right. So we have these multitude of organs. Like I mentioned in the beginning, all those organs can be divided up into two categories functionally. What we call the conducting zone, which consists of really from the nasal cavity all the way through the structures I mentioned, through the trachea, the bronchi, and to what we call the terminal bronchioles. Excuse me. So these look fairly different from each other, but the commonality is that they're all involved, they're respiratory passageways that convey air. And as air moves through all of these regions, from the nasal cavity to the trachea, bronchi, terminal bronchioles, the air is filtered, cleaned up, humidified, so moistened, and warmed. These three things are really what we refer to as air conditioning. When air first comes into the body, like I mentioned, it's not clean, it's not pure, but also that it's also dry. And it's also temperature-wise, it's not the same temperature as the body. So in order to protect the respiratory structures, to prevent them from damage, we need to filter, moisten, and warm the air. Excuse me. Now, what provides for this in some aspects is the presence of ciliated epithelium. You probably remember from many weeks ago our discussion of epithelia and the different types. And the respiratory tract is known for the presence of ciliated epithelium, starting off with pseudostratified, but as we'll learn, that epithelium actually changes. The epithelium serves an important role in the sense that whatever dirt or dust or anything or pathogens that are trapped due to the role of mucus, that epithelium acts as a sweeping motion. It sweeps the mucus along with the junk upwards, kind of like an elevator, up through the trachea, out into the oral cavity where it's expectorated and then we swallow, but we get it out of the respiratory tract. People who have cystic fibrosis, I'm not going to go into much detail here, but have a problem in the sense that this condition causes the body to make thicker mucus than normal. And the problem with that is, well, the mucus certainly helps in trapping dirty particles, but the problem is it's so thick they can't be moved out of the respiratory tract, which creates a buildup of pathogens and junk and everything, which makes these people very prone to respiratory infections. All right, so this takes us all the way through the terminal bronchioles. From the terminal bronchioles, the air then passes into what we call the respiratory zone, which consists of the respiratory bronchioles, which are these just after the terminal bronchioles, and continues into these grape-like clusters, which are known as alveoli, and that's where gas exchange occurs. All right, so this is sort of like an old image, old animation, but I think it gets the point across. This just to kind of give you an idea of what we call the respiratory epithelium, where we have these lining cells that are ciliated, and in between them, we have these mucus-producing cells called goblet cells. The mucus works its way up to the surface, traps any of the particulates, and the cilia on this epithelium sweep it back up the respiratory tract. Oops. All right, so let's start off with the trachea as far as respiratory structures in the conducting zone. I'm not going to start with the nose or larynx. I'm just going to get right to the trachea just because this is where we see a lot of interesting stuff going on, a lot of changes, but you should know that it all begins with the nose. All right, so what can we say about the trachea? Trachea is also known as the windpipe, and the trachea and the more superior larynx are characterized by having cartilage. All I've mentioned so far is the respiratory tract has epithelium and it has mucus cells. But with the trachea, we also have hyaline cartilage that's arranged in a C-like fashion. Hence, we call it C cartilage or C-shaped cartilage or C-ring. Sometimes they're called C-rings. Now, it's interesting. You notice that it is a C-shaped. It doesn't go all the way around. And this is very significant because this organ just behind it is the esophagus. The esophagus, of course, is where food travels down, part of the digestive tract. We certainly don't want cartilage up against it, right? That would kind of create some difficulties, not make it impossible, but it would make it difficulty for food to be pushed down the digestive tract if you've got this extra cartilage. So we've got this muscle there called the trachealis muscle instead. All right. So respiratory epithelium. So the lining of the epithelium is also known as the mucosa or the mucous membrane, and it consists of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial cells along with goblet cells. Behind that, of course, we have the cartilage. So if you remember three main things of the trachea: PSCC, goblet cells, and underlying cartilage, as well as some extra exocrine mucus glands. So we've got a lot of mucus being produced here. This is, of course, part of the conducting zone, right, where air is filtered and cleaned out. As the air moves down the trachea, of course, we see this bifurcation or split. Where it splits or bifurcates is known as the carina. So this area right here is known as the carina, where then the trachea now splits off into what are called the primary bronchi. Just a close-up view of the tracheal wall once again. So just to kind of give you an idea, we have the PSCC. We not only have goblet cells, but we have these underlying mucus cells or exocrine glands, all contributing to mucus. So not only do the goblet cells produce the mucus, but these other exocrine glands that are found just below. This is taking a look at the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium along with the intervening goblet cells. So this is what the cilia looks like. Very hair-like, moves, as I mentioned, kind of like a broom. From the trachea, the air then moves into the bronchi. And one of the things you can see, of course, is that the bronchi branch, much like branching into arterioles. The initial branch, or the initial branch off the trachea, is called the primary bronchi, but then this splits off into what we call the secondary bronchi, which are also known as the lobar bronchi, found in both lobes, which we'll learn about later. Once the secondary bronchi split, they become what's known as the tertiary bronchi. So those are the three main branches of the bronchi. We have the primary, we have the secondary, and we have the tertiary. Characteristics of the bronchi, and I might add later on into the bronchioles. Collectively, this is known as the bronchial tree. So anything from the primary bronchi to the secondary bronchi to the tertiary bronchi, and then going down into the bronchiole, that's all called the bronchial tree. So what are some of the changes we see? Starting with the primary bronchi, we still have these C rings. Once we split off into the secondary bronchi, those C rings become plates of cartilage. And those small plates continue into the tertiary. Down here, they get smaller and smaller. So there's a gradual decrease in the amount of cartilage. But not only that, by the time we reach the bronchioles, there is no cartilage. You notice the diameter greatly decreases. With that decrease in diameter, we see a loss of cartilage, and also the epithelium goes from a PSCC to a simple columnar down to a simple cuboidal. Again, another comparison with the blood vessels. Remember, with the arteries, we had 3 layers. With the arterioles, we have 2 layers, right? A little different in terms with the tunicas, right? With the 3 layers of tunica versus the 2 layers. Different in terms of the terms and the makeup of the wall, but nonetheless, there are changes. And these branches and getting smaller and everything have to do a lot with what's going on downstream. As we gradually transition into the respiratory zone, the epithelium needs to get smaller to allow for diffusion of air, of oxygen. It would be very difficult for oxygen to move from here all the way across, right? We need to have, to get to the blood, it would take a long time. So the epithelium gets smaller and smaller, and as you'll soon see, by the time we get to the alveoli, it's simple squamous. All right, so here's another view of the bronchi. Probably the secondary bronchi, I'm thinking, because this is the hyaline cartilage, which you guys are already familiar with looking at. You notice it's not a continuous ring. There's these little plates. There's one here, there's one there. This is the simple, well, it might be pseudostratified. It's probably more simple columnar epithelium up here. And one of the things that I want to add that we start to see a fair amount of as we transition from the trachea down through the bronchi, eventually the bronchioles, is an increase in the amount of smooth muscle. So decrease in cartilage, thinning out of the epithelium, increase in smooth muscle. This is significant, much the same way that the muscle was in the arterioles. Remember, the arterioles, the epithelium helps to regulate blood flow, right? In this case, the smooth muscle in the bronchioles helps to regulate airflow. And those of you that have asthma or know of someone that does, the bronchoconstriction or the spasm has to do with the effect on the muscles. All right. So to kind of summarize again, there's a loss of cartilage, um, decrease in epithelium, increased role of the smooth muscle, which becomes very important as we get further down into the bronchioles. And the reason why it gets important, as I mentioned, is its role in regulating airflow, but also the susceptibility to constriction or dilation, which is under the control of the autonomic nervous system. With sympathetic stimulation, the bronchioles will dilate. Fight or flight, we want more air coming in. With parasympathetic, there's bronchoconstriction. So that's why people who have asthma, one of the treatments is albuterol, which mimics the effect of sympathetic stimulation. All right. So once we've reached the bronchioles, and actually technically not until we reach the respiratory bronchioles and down into the alveoli, we're now in the respiratory zone. And this is where we start to see the air that was already filtered starts to move into the blood. In order for this to happen, this is where we're going to see some of those structure-function correlations. The surface of the respiratory tract gets thinner. And you can see right here, all right, this happens to be the alveoli, which we'll take a look at a little bit later. These are these kind of little grapes within a grape cluster. This is where we see simple squamous epithelium, very thin, which allows air to move very rapidly from the breathing tubes all the way into the blood. Those are little blood vessels. With all this branching, with all this, I should say, not only branching, but formation of these little grapes, we're greatly increasing the surface area, right? Much like we did in circulation. Increasing the surface area is going to maximize our ability to exchange gases, in this case, by moving oxygen into the blood. And you can see these are all capillaries, these grapes, but look at the red and the blue. The capillaries are just, I'm sorry, the alveoli are just inundated with blood vessels, just inundated with them, which obviously you want. You want the air to flow across a very thin surface into the capillaries. Oops. Okay, so as I mentioned, the respiratory zone starts with the respiratory bronchioles and continues into the alveoli. What starts to happen as we go from the respiratory bronchioles into the alveoli, the epithelium becomes simple, squamous, and the muscle that we started to see building up, in the bronchioles starts to disappear. And so all we're left with is simple squamous epithelium, which leads the air from the respiratory bronchioles into what we call the alveolar ducts, finally into the alveolar sacs. And these are the sacs which contain individual alveoli, which is a site for gas exchange. All right, so what can we say about the alveoli? Well, this is true with any part of the respiratory zone. It's well vascularized. Lot of capillaries surround it. Just to give you an idea of this branching that we spoke about, remember we started off with one trachea, two primary bronchi. This eventually leads, I know it's hard to fathom this, roughly about 400 million, these are all microscopic, alveoli per lung, which accounts for the tremendous surface area, which leads to, if you were to calculate it out, the surface area of the alveoli is about 1,500 square feet, roughly 140 square meters, which is a lot. You know, and you've heard stories with if you were to stretch DNA, how far it would go, right? The reason why you don't see it at first is because it's all folded, right? This is because of this branching and grapes that you don't actually see the extent of the surface area, but nonetheless, a lot more surface area here. All right. So what do we know about the alveoli? So now we've zoomed in, we're right in here. We're in the alveoli. If you zoom into the alveoli, you already know, as I mentioned, that the main cell type is the simple squamous epithelium. We often refer to that as the type 1 alveoli. I'm sorry, type 1 cell. And these cells are surrounded by a kind of a glue-like structure, which is known as the basal lamina. So this is the type 1 alveoli cell. This is the basal lamina, is kind of a glue. Now, if you take a look, this is a key thing, what we call the respiratory membrane. For air to go, it's obviously come in from the bronchioles into the alveoli. Once it's in the alveoli, of course, it needs to reach the capillaries. In order to reach the capillaries, it has to, of course, cross through this type 1 cell. Then it's got to cross this glue, this basal lamina, and then it's got to cross the capillary endothelial cell, otherwise known as, if you remember, the tunica intima or the tunica externa. These 3 layers are known as the respiratory membrane. And people who have respiratory diseases, whether it's emphysema or others, quite often this area is scarred and thickened, which makes it difficult to breathe, to exchange air. So this is the respiratory membrane, the 3 layers that I mentioned. So here's the alveoli. The type 1 cell is this one, these little thin ones. But you might notice that we've got other stuff going on. Well, we also have another cell, ideally called the type 2 cell. The type 2 cell, sometimes in books, is also known as the septal cell. It's this one right here, where this is the type 1, this really thin cell. This is the septal cell. This cell is, its claim to fame is it produces a substance known as surfactant. Surfactant is basically like a detergent that reduces surface tension by breaking water molecules within the alveoli. Now, physiologically, the significance of that is that water molecules, you may have learned from chemistry, water likes water, and water forms hydrogen bonds with other molecules. This creates kind of like a sheet that can essentially prevent the alveoli from inflating when air comes in. We don't want that. The surfactant breaks up the hydrogen bonds, which allows the alveoli to inflate and then to deflate, kind of back and forth, which is what we want. Surfactant is produced while we're still in fetal development. So children that are born, say, earlier than 34 weeks, say, if you think of a typical pregnancy being 40 weeks, less than 34 weeks, the baby has not started to make surfactant. So if they are born prematurely, they typically need to undergo special treatment, maybe a ventilator. Fortunately, now science has reached the point where certain companies manufacture artificial surfactant, which can not only be useful for premature babies, but also adults who suffer certain types of respiratory disorders. All right, so surfactant, which is again produced by these type 2 cells, a couple terms to mention: it increases what's known as pulmonary compliance. Now, if you look at the word compliance and think kind of outside of the realm of biology or science, you think of somebody being compliant, meaning that they're going along with everything, they're flexible. Question? Oh, all right. Going along with everything. That has to do with the fact that compliance in lungs has to do with the ease that lungs inflate. And of course, as I mentioned, if you break up these water molecules or the hydrogen bonding, that's going to allow the lung to inflate. A lung that's poorly compliant is what you find with other certain diseases where it doesn't inflate properly. So just some terms to introduce to you. Finally, the third cell is the alveolar macrophage. And much like the microglia in the brain, This is a type of cell that does its job by engulfing particles, removing pathogens. Essentially, and it's also migratory. Much like microglia can move throughout the brain, alveolar macrophages can move throughout the respiratory tract. And they help to kind of clean things up. Some books are also refer to these as dust cells, but typically I call them just alveolar macrophages. All right. So here we've kind of taken a nice journey down through the respiratory tract, at least up through the alveoli. And you can see, again, that once you reach the alveoli, there's a lot of capillaries, blood vessels throughout. This is where we find the respiratory membrane. And remember, the respiratory membrane is comprised of three things: the capillary endothelium, or the tunica interna, the type 1 alveolar cells, and the intervening basal lamina, which is that glue. And you want to keep that area as thin as possible. All right, let me just see where I'm at right now for a second. 20, okay. You know what? Let me just take a look, see where I want to go with this. You know what? I think I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. Let me back up for a second. So I'm going to stop at the lungs. On Wednesday, we'll finish this up. There's like 18 more slides. We'll go through the lungs. We'll talk about the mechanism of breathing, all the things that regulate it. And like I mentioned, we will also start preparing again for the next lecture exam. So let me go ahead and transition out of this here. Is anybody have any questions before I kind of release you guys to go take your lab exam, which starts at 10?
I don't have any.
Okay. All right, you guys. Well, good luck on the lab exam. And anyway, so good luck at the exam, and I'm recording this lecture, so I'll see you guys on Wednesday. I do have office hours today, from 10 to 11, which obviously wouldn't help you guys out, also from 3 to 4. So if you guys need to stop by, have any questions, I'll be here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. See you guys later.
Thank you, Professor.